Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to the July 2021, edition of CANN's Journal Club. My name is Kyle Boyer, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. And today we're going to be talking about Delta-8 THC and its conversion from CBD, which has recently become a bit of a widespread trend due to this saturated hemp market. And let me go ahead and mute somebody because it seems like there's a bit of background. Okay, I think that fixed it. All right, so anyway, for this special edition of Journal Club, we've gathered a panel of experts in D8 production, pharmacology, analytical testing, and legal matters to address this topic. So let's go ahead and kick things off. I'll have each speaker give a brief introduction, and then we can dive into some questions. Dr. Gerdeman, you want to start?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Kyle, and to the group. My name is Greg Gerdeman. I have a doctorate in pharmacology from Vanderbilt that I finished in 2001. So I started studying cannabinoid chemistry from a perspective of endocannabinoid neuroscience and synaptic physiology in the mid 90s, and have followed it ever since. I won't go long since we've got multiple presenters, but I've been a NIH and NSF funded researcher. I have been a college professor for 9 years, a professor of biology at Eckerd College. I left that to get into the cannabis industry, helping to co-found one of the first licensed medical cannabis companies in Florida. I've been a chief scientific officer for a national hemp extraction company. So I've followed cannabis pharmacology pretty much nonstop for the past 25 years or so, and am happy to contribute to this ongoing discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Gerdeman. Let's go ahead and move to Dr. Scialdone.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yep, sure can. Is your video working?
Hold on a second. Let me turn it on. I'm driving in a car. I hope not to be driving shortly, but I'm at the campus of Colorado State University. My daughter is having her orientation tour today, and I'm missing that to be on this call with y'all. So
well, we're very grateful for your presence, Dr. Mark.
Happy to be here, but it's great to be back in Fort Collins. I did a postdoc for a very famous professor in chemistry here about 30 years ago, and so it's sort of very nostalgic for me to be back. It's also the first place I ever grew indoors. Back in early '92, we were growing some cuttings of some skunk #1. So it's kind of like a merging of chemistry and cannabis science. But I'm a PhD in chemistry who understands cannabinoid science and have some patents in the area. And yeah, happy to contribute to this discussion.
Thanks, Dr. Mark. And just a reminder to our audience, if you could please mute your microphones. There's a few of you that have kind of had some background noise, and we'd like to be able to hear all the presenters here. So Dr. Sams, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this talk today. In my past life, earned a doctoral degree in the area of pharmaceutics from the Ohio State University. I was a professor of pharmacology at Ohio State and the University of Florida in the veterinary school. So I taught veterinary students pharmacology. My specialty is in the area of pharmacokinetics and drug metabolism. Since 2019, I've been scientific director for the KCA laboratory. This is an independent third-party laboratory that tests hemp for a variety of substances, cannabinoids, heavy metals, residual solvents, the typical lineup of analyses that are required of hemp. And for the past year or so, we've been heavily involved in the analysis of Delta-8. And I think some of the questions that you have will shed some light on our contributions and the difficulties that we've encountered in the analysis of Delta-8 that we've received for testing. Thank you.
There's quite a bit of difficulties there, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you've seen out there in the field. Dr. Depor, do you want to jump in?
Hi, everyone. My name is Yvonne Depor, and I currently work for Orion GMP Solutions, which is a consulting firm. But very soon, I'm going to start a position as an analytical R&D scientist at Charlotte's Web in Colorado. So I'm currently moving from Michigan to Colorado. And I first learned about D8 when I was working at PSI Labs in Michigan, an analytical testing lab. And I have a PhD in organic chemistry from University of Michigan. And then I went on to work at PSI Labs doing some pesticide testing, and then also like the full suite of analytical tests for the state of Michigan regulation. So I was interested in testing D8 because one of like a client of a kind of like a connection of a client with Orion GMP, that's a CBD hemp company, started making D8. So I was just really curious to see what their D8 was testing, because I knew, like, I trusted PSI Labs to do that testing. So I'm going to present these results at the upcoming ACS conference in the small chemical business division. And yeah, I'd be happy to answer any questions about that today. Thanks.
Thanks, Yvonne. Chelsie, you want to jump in?
Sure. Thank you guys so much for having me to weigh in on the legal side. I have a dearth of doctorates in any pharmacological activities, but I'm well versed in the hot button issue of whether Delta 8 is legal. I am a founding member of Ritter PLLC, which is a hemp and cannabis law firm, and we are based in Texas. We have offices in both Texas and Florida, and I am more than excited to be here today.
We're grateful to have you, Chelsie. Thank you. So I'll go ahead and dive into some of our first questions. And since we're on Chelsie currently, let's go ahead and actually get some clarification here. We probably heard about some raids yesterday. And I guess that sort of answers the question somewhat, but I'd like you to elaborate. So does the Farm Bill actually make the case for legal D8, or is it federally illegal?
So I do want to clarify, there was some buzz going on around online that the Champs trade show had been raided by the DEA. And I was shocked to see that, because that's very far out of DEA protocol. They're a very smart agency. If they're going to test a regulatory gray area like this, they're not going to do it in a circuit that has such an unfavorable regulatory path. But I called one of my clients who was actually there, and it seems like what actually happened is local regulators from the Cannabis Policy Board came out, because there were some issues with people handing out some non-compliant samples. But let's start with a basic premise. Suffice to say, the question of whether Delta 8 is federally legal is far from settled. And that's simply because no reviewing court has yet to weigh in. I postulate as to how I think the court would rule, and I do line with the DEA position, but proponents of legality argue that the 2018 Farm Bill expanded the 2014 Farm Bill's definition of hemp to specifically include the term cannabinoids and their derivatives and extracts. It also amended the Federal Controlled Substances Act to remove tetrahydrocannabinol from hemp. And that's where the real fight lies here, because those two words, from hemp, and I'm sure everybody on the call is going to hear a lot about the fact that there is no commercially available strain of cannabis sativa L that presents Delta 8 in enough quantifiable extractable quantities to be commercially viable for companies. So what everybody is doing is taking cannabidiol derived naturally from the plant and converting it. The DEA thinks this is a problem. It's well established that they believe Delta 8, when converted, is a synthetic THC. And we know this for a variety of factors. In late 2020, the DEA released an interim final rule where they stated that the statutory definition of hemp in the Farm Bill is limited to materials derived directly from cannabis sativa L. And they stated that all synthetically derived THC are Schedule I substances. And though the DEA has never defined what it means by synthetic, there's a well-documented 20-year history that they believe pharmacologically created substances are Schedule I. Delta 8 is scheduled in their Orange Book. They've discussed scheduling distinctions in 2001 guidance opinions, where they specifically refer to synthetic equivalents of substances contained in the cannabis plant. And they go on to define them as synthetic substances with similar chemical structures and pharmacological activity. And note that they were specifically referring in this 2001 guidance document to the distinction between naturally scheduled THC derived directly from the cannabis plant and synthetic. We've also seen them use terms, synthetic cannabinoids, been discussing substances such as spice, and in their guiding of interpreting opinions on those substances, they've
You're
said
welcome.
that these are pharmacologically created materials or lab and those are the words that they continue to use. So I have no qualms that the DA believes it's Schedule 1. And I don't think that a reviewing court would agree with the proponents who are running around saying it is 100% federally legal, because one thing the court will look at is congressional intent. And we've had several of the original drafters of the Farm Bill state that this is far from what they intended for a psychoactive substance, an analog of Delta-9, to be sold commercially on the market.
Gotcha. Thank you for that very thorough explanation. Yeah, there's a lot there's a lot of confusion out there, right? And there's, it's clear, like you said, there's clearly some disagreement out there, but I'm glad you could clear that up for us. So while we're on the topic also of synthesis and how this is produced, let's go ahead and move to the chemistry side. So what kind of chemical conversion is taking place when we're actually making D8 from CBD? So I will let our resident chemists jump in here. Who would like to take that one? Maybe
Well,
Dr.
I'm a chemist. Can I
Yeah.
help? I'm a chemist. So, the plant makes Delta-9 configured cannabinoids, right? And that refers to the position of the double bond that's in the methyl cyclohexene ring. And so Delta-8 doesn't naturally form. However, Delta-8 is thermodynamically more stable than Delta-9. So if given the opportunity, Delta-8 will take a thermodynamic ride a few kcals down in energy down to Delta-8. And so in the modern cannabis era, the first time I started seeing Delta-8 is when people were using clay to decolorize dark distillate and noticing that they were seeing conversion from the Delta-9 configured material in the distillate over to Delta-8, right? So most of what is out on the market today is coming from a different isomerization, which is the isomerization of CBD. So CBD you recognize as what we call a constitutional isomer. Has the same molecular formula, same atoms, just sort of different geometry and different ring structure. So it was shown early by Adams and then later by Meshulam in great detail that acid converts CBD to THC through pronation of the exocyclic methylene and closure of the benzopyrene ring system. There's two double bonds in CBD and there's two hydroxyls in CBD. And so those two hydroxyls can undergo the same type of proton-assisted ether formation. And that's the formation of what we call the iso-THC isomers, where the methyl cyclohexene double bond undergoes protonative cyclization to form an ether linkage with resorcinol. It could actually happen twice. There's a compound called cannabitracin, where both double bonds are protonated and both hydroxyls add, and that's a very, very minor cannabinoid, but the formation of the exo or iso is a little bit less preferred because it's not thermodynamically favored because it's an odd ring structure. It's a bicyclic ring structure, and by nature, those things are just less geometrically favored to form. So in the formation of the tetrahydrocannabinol from CBD, you do get isomerization of the natural configuration, which is in Delta-9, over to Delta-8, because in most cases, the catalysts that are used, which are acids, are capable of isomerizing that double bond as well. Most, not all. And this is well described in the literature, not only by Meshulam, but a lot of researchers who came in and did work in the post-Meshulam era. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mark. So I'm curious, in this ring closure that people are doing, I mean, a lot of people are getting their information from online. Many of them aren't exactly classically trained chemists. So we have a lot of interesting things out there on the market right now. Are there any reagents or solvents that people have been using that should absolutely be avoided when producing Delta 8?
Well, to be avoided, absolutely, for certain. I don't think you should do this chemistry. I don't think anyone should do this chemistry who's not a synthetic chemist. I think a synthetic chemist needs to be running this chemistry because, again, when you use a catalyst is not a stoichiometric amount of material. I'm not sure that people understand the difference between a stoichiometric and a catalytic amount of material. Also, the fact that you can get the two different major THC isomers, namely Delta 8 and Delta 9 from this is a classic manifestation of a kinetic versus a thermodynamic product. Your kinetic product is the Delta 9 configured material. So you can make Delta 9 from the cyclization of CBD. However, if given the opportunity, it will isomerize over into Delta 8. But there are Lewis acids, in fact, that you can use to basically promote just the formation of Delta 9, but it's very, very easy to drive off the Delta 8 cliff, which is what a lot of people do. So most commonly, Kyle, people are using paratoluene sulfonic acid. That was the acid that Meshulam described in his paper, and I think there's a couple patents on it as well. This topic of conversion of CBD over to THC isomers was recently reviewed last year by a group of Italian paisanos. Very, very nice review of different effect of different acids and different conditions on the different cyclization products you get. And you should look at that paper and certainly be concerned with not only some of the Lewis acids that are being used, but the product distribution ratios of that basically show that there are no clean set of reaction conditions, at least not disclosed in that paper, that selectively only generate a single product as a pure isomer. I'll stop there.
And that's, I think, where some of the concerns lie, is, you know, all these other byproducts, some of them unknown, that are being seen. So next, I'll move over to more of a pharmacology side of things. So some have dubbed Delta 8 as THC light. Can one of our pharmacologists in the meeting room here kind of shed some light on if that's, you know, qualify or disqualify that statement, that it's THC light?
Well, I'll happily jump in at first. I mean, there's two different sort of bodies of evidence here. Some of it is older, that comes from researching Delta 8 as a well-described, you know, an obvious cannabinoid in the labs. The others is the growing body of human experience that's going on. The human experience that's going on is a lot of people trying different products, and the problem is it's not consistent or accurately labeled in large regard. There's, you know, Delta 9 in there, there's Delta 8. You might say there's 20, 50 milligrams of Delta 8, but some of that might be a stereoisomer with much lower affinity at receptors than the other. But it's clear that Delta 8 and Delta 9 side by side are both partial agonists at CB1 and CB2 receptors. The studies that have been done have been in cellular studies of transfected cells with CB1, for example, showing that Delta 8, it seems to have lower potency than Delta 9. And that means that this is a chemist forum, so I'll speak in chemistry here. I mean, that these are displacement studies that were done for primarily. Delta 8 can displace other molecules from the CB1 receptor It is less effective at doing that at delta 9, so it has a lower potency. But in the few studies that have been done, looking at actual cellular and behavioral effects, delta 8 may well have the same efficacy as delta 9. What's the take home with that? I think that delta 8 will create a lesser effect than delta 9 by dose. This is not controversial. People take 20 mgs of delta 8 and don't have the same effect as they would delta 9. But there's no good scientific evidence in my mind that the differences can't be overcome by dose. And I think you take a whopping high dose of delta 8, you'll go down the same kinds of experiences, including the anxiety holes that people get into with high dose edibles. And molecularly and behaviorally, I don't I think that's something that's going on. So it's important to know that it may be THC light, but that doesn't mean that it can't get into the extremely distressing experiences that delta 9 high doses can get. And lastly, I think I'll just throw in there that I tend to think that what's going on right now, and I interact with a lot of people who say, I'm taking delta 8 gummies and I love them. Don't hate on this stuff. I'm not on a crusade against delta 8. I'm against the contaminants and the transparency and all these issues. But I also think that a lot of people are discovering that low dose THC is pretty great for what they're after. And they're getting results from like 30 milligrams of delta 8, and they've never really tried taking 3 and 4 and 5 milligrams of delta 9. But that's just, something to throw out there from what I think pharmacologically is happening. And I'll maybe, let Richard say something or.
Yeah, and I guess, this is another question that I have that relates to pharmacology and I guess really metabolism. So is this, when you orally ingest delta 8, is this the same type of transformation that we see in the liver? And could we elaborate maybe on this metabolite and the differences between 11-hydroxy, maybe THC, delta 9 THC, and this other metabolite?
Precisely the same metabolism happens. You have 11-hydroxy delta 8 THC formed. There is evidence that it has affinity and actions at CB1 receptors. But again, most of this is 30-year-old research in transfected cells that tell you something about molecular receptor interactions, but that you'd have to have a lot of head-to-head studies. The metabolism hasn't been carefully studied to anything I've seen.
Thanks for the clarification there. Yeah, I mean, I could see potentially people having a bad time if it's a similar, metabolite, because it's, as many of you, I'm sure, in the audience have experienced, if you take a big edible dose and wait 2 hours, sometimes it's not always the best time. So, and now I'm going to go ahead and switch gears a little bit and move towards testing. So, for our testing lab folks, what are some of the common problems that we're encountering out there in the field when we're testing some of these D8 products? Are there any specific matrices that have been incredibly challenging, or would like to hear a little more about that?
I'd be happy to begin the discussion. In our experience, most of the analyses of delta 8 are being done on reverse phase HPLC systems. The first problem is that delta 8 and delta 9 are not very well resolved in a lot of C18 reverse phase systems. And so you need to pay a lot of attention to the chromatographic conditions in order to get baseline resolution of delta 8 and delta 9. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that in the synthetic materials, we first noticed some distortions of the delta 8 and delta 9 peaks under reverse phase conditions. We did some investigation. We intentionally synthesized the iso compounds that Mark referred to. And what we've clearly demonstrated, and this isn't new, this is old information, and that is that delta 8 iso co-elutes with delta 8 in reverse phase systems, and delta 4-8 iso elutes on the shoulder of delta 9. And the consequence of all of that is that we have determined that reverse phase HPLC is not an appropriate means of determining delta 8 from these synthetic mixtures because you can't resolve the iso compounds from them. So what you end up getting is an overestimation of the delta 8 content because of the contribution from delta 8 iso. And if the delta 4,8 iso concentration is sufficiently high, you're not able to differentiate it from the delta 9. And so the delta 9 goes underreported in those reverse phase systems. So we've resorted to GCMS analysis of these synthetic mixtures. Delta 8 and delta 9 THC are readily resolved on a 35% phenyl polysiloxane stationary phase. Delta 8 iso THC and delta 4,8 iso THC are resolved. The delta 4,8 iso THC is it elutes just before delta 8 iso THC, but they are all resolved. We have intentionally synthesized the iso compounds, and we've studied the changes in their concentrations as a function of time. The reaction mixture started with CBD. We used BF3 dietherate as the catalyst for the isomerization and ring closure. In the earliest samples collected, we see a lot of delta 8 iso and some delta 9. And in the 5-minute sample after initiating the reaction, that's what we see. There's still a little bit of CBD present. By the 10-minute sample, all of the CBD is gone. The delta 9 is now being converted to delta 8. And after several hours, we then begin to see some of the delta 4,8 iso. In the actual samples that we've received for testing, there is almost always evidence for delta 4,8 iso in those submitted samples. And again, that's the material that interferes with the determination of delta 9. So we've tested delta 8 synthetic materials. We almost always report a higher concentration of delta 9 THC than other laboratories that use reverse phase HPLC are reporting. And I think the reason for that is that they've got coelution with the delta 4,8 iso, and they're not differentiating it adequately for analysis.
Hey, Richard.
Yes.
Can I ask a quick question? Have you seen olivitol in any of these samples?
We've looked for olivitol. We have not detected it.
Oh, okay.
Interesting, because I've been seeing
Very interesting.
Because I've seen mixed answers on that, and I've seen some evidence to suggest it and that it's a common contaminant. But I guess in your work you have not been seeing it, so that's interesting to hear. And I imagine that there are different routes to arrive at different byproducts as well. So I'm guessing that would largely depend on what you are using as your starting material and your catalysts and such.
Yeah, the reason why I bring it up, Kyle, is there's two different reasons. And obviously one is that it could actually be synthesized, right, from olivitol, right? So you could do the prenylation chemistry to basically make essentially some precursor to delta 8, which then ultimately goes to delta 8. But the other thing, and this thing is troubling as well, is that in 1974, Razdan and co-workers published in the Journal of the American Chemical Society a very thorough paper that went through that mechanistic study of using BF3. And what they found is that there is an equilibrium when you treat CBD with BF3 between a deprenylated product and olivitol, again, as the BF3 salt. So if that happens, if you think about it, if you're starting with CBD and you see olivitol in that sample, what that means is that retro-Friedel-Crafts alkylation occurs, and when given the opportunity on Olivital, it could recombine at the non-natural site, which is going to generate a whole new set of not stereoisomers, a whole new set of abnormal tetrahydrocannabinol isomers. So that's the paper from Rasdan in 1974. I'll stop there.
Alrighty.
You know, Mark, I'm just going to jump in unsolicited and say that a large majority, I think, of folks synthesizing Delta 8 right now could not pick up those papers by Rasdan and understand what was being talked about, and the ways that, I mean, I see people on these forums, you know, talking about how, well, the acid just blows the CBD apart, and that's why you get Olivital, and it just requires a greater understanding than that.
Yeah, I concur.
It certainly does. I guess one of the follow-up questions I'd like to ask Richard is, do you see, so you don't see Olivital, but do you see the abnormal substituted tetrahydrocannabinol isomers in any of the D8 samples you've looked at?
I don't know whether we do or not. We have a number of unidentified materials with the correct molecular weight. But in the absence of standards, I don't know what they are.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that this equilibrium is a very interesting equilibrium, because the other thing that it would point out, especially if we're finding Olivital in these samples, is that when you break that carbon-carbon bond between the prenyl portion of the molecule and the Olivital portion, is when you recombine, you can get diastereomers, right? Because it could attack from either top or bottom, right? It doesn't necessarily have to go one way or the other. But again, the other thing that, you know, to me would be troubling would be that now you have a set of abnormal isomers, and Richard, those are going to be the same molecular weight because they're just going to get substituted on the different carbon of Olivital, right? So if we see Olivital and we see some of these other peaks in there, what that also indicates is that that terpenyl cation, that's part of that ion pair that comes apart in that retro-Friedel Crafts reaction. Ooh, our organic professors would be loving us, right? Actually has a fate unto itself. And so that terpenyl cation could basically polymerize and draw itself away from the equilibrium to get beyond one-to-one chemistry again. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Dr. Mark. And that's really interesting insights there. And because yeah, there's definitely a mixed bag of data out there, and there's a lot of different things that different people are seeing. So thank you for shedding some light on that. So I'd like to jump back to the legal aspect of things. We heard a bit about, you know, the Farm Bill and basically federal regulation or federal law, essentially, when it comes to Delta 8. But I'd like to hear a little bit more about what states are doing about it. There's been a lot of different states that have moved to ban Delta 8. And I was hoping, Chelsie, you could maybe shed some light on which states are banning it and really what the reasoning behind these bans are.
Sure. So let's start with the reasoning, because I want to echo some of the sentiments expressed by Dr. Sams and Dr. Gerdeman. And they used the key words there, which were absence of standards, unregulated, and then noting that so many at the business level in the industry are conducting these very tests that require a very particular subset of skills. It's often in the absence of those, particularly in the intra-company level. So states are reacting because there have been a lot of adverse events reported with Delta 8 substances. I've heard from some of the dominant cannabis laboratories that we work with that they found highly volatile substances in some of these products. Most do test hot. The industry will push back against that and blame the testing, but it's no secret that many times these products are testing exceedingly hot on the Delta 9 side, which makes them both federally legal and illegal at the state level. But suffice to say, as of today, we've seen at least 18 states that have moved towards enacting regulatory bans on Delta 8 or limiting the substance. And the problem is that absence federal guidance, we now have a hodgepodge of Delta 8 regulations across the United States. So for risk inherent clients who are engaged in Delta 8 production or manufacturing activities, we have to target their sales and marketing activities to permissible states. What we've really seen is three primary approaches. The first would be states like Nevada and Colorado, who are moving to ban all isomers of THC that are in excess of the Delta 9, the 0.3% federal threshold. We've seen states who specifically have banned only Delta 8 while leaving any other synthetic cannabinoid alone, which is frankly a problem on the regulatory side because there are up and coming synthetic cannabinoids like THC acetate and THCO, which are certainly become more prevalent in these conversations. We've seen states like Florida, very surprising stance down in Florida, to come out and say, as long as your total THC is below our allotment, you are perfectly fine. And then we've seen states such as New York, Vermont, that specifically come down with language reiterating the DEA stance, saying, we believe that synthetic cannabinoids are illegal, but again, we really lack a definition at the federal level of what synthetic constitutes. So that leaves a lot of gray areas across the nation and a huge hurdle in trying to advise clients on the legality of intrastate D8.
Wow, yeah, that's quite a bit of different approaches there, some of which I'm not quite sure that I agree with, but hey, we'll see how it all shakes out. So next question I have is a little bit more on the economics side and the landscape of the market. So of course, as we just discussed, CBD can also be converted into D9 inexpensively because it is, not a selective reaction. So are we seeing some economic shifts as a result of this cheap way of producing D9? Are we seeing normal D9 from the plant that you would normally get? Well, I guess, decarboxylated plant-derived, right? Cannabis-derived. Are we taking cannabis-derived, and seeing that basically that's kind of shifting and we're getting Delta 9 derived from hemp more so now, especially with, CBD kilos being so cheap. It seems like we might see that sort of thing. Are any of the panelists seeing that in where they reside?
No, I haven't heard of it. Economics, I don't think those economics make sense yet. And I would think that any of these reactions give a plethora of products. So you're going to have to do some type of distillation to turn it into a distillate. And the best distillate I've seen of D8, I have seen an 85% D8. It had about 4% D9. But then again, it's got, 10 or 12% of other stuff. What that other stuff is, who knows? So I'm not sure that, although there's a lot of chatter in 4200 and elsewhere, that there is a good way of making D8 that's void of these products. You talked about D9. That's a very difficult reaction. As I think Richard alluded to, is that this thermodynamic manifold that you populate when you start pushing these molecules down the roller coaster, you can't you can't keep them from happening. And I think this really speaks to the magic of the plant, Kyle, because the plant does this without BF3 and in a stereoselective fashion. It only makes one, doesn't make a plethora, doesn't make any isos. So I wanted to reiterate too, I think a real opportunity here, Richard mentioned making those synthetic isos. What we need really to regulate this industry is we need analytical standards. So all the analytical labs can basically plug those in. And we know, yes, that's ISO 48 or that's ISO this or ISO that. Yeah, that's great. And I think some of the people on this call will be the people that move this issue forward. Thank you. That's it.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly concur. The standards thing is a really big issue. How are we supposed to test for some of these contaminants and other byproducts if we have no analytical standards to actually do the testing with? So yes, I share that sentiment quite a bit. What kind of steps can Delta 8 producers take to ensure that they're making a clean product that is free of unknown byproducts? Because obviously we don't have standards for it. So what steps can we take?
I feel like the only way to really be sure at this point is by NMR or by like a very, very selective type of chiral column, which I think is kind of maybe out of the reach of producers.
Yeah, NMR, you have a really nice diagnostic shift in both proton and carbon to distinguish between the isomers Delta 8, Delta 9, and Delta 10 for that matter. So NMR is great. However, what you can't see by NMR, or what you don't always see by NMR, are some of these small minor products, and you could see again the isos. You can't really tell at what quantity they're in because you're sort of beyond the limit of being able to use integration or anything. But NMR, both C13 and proton, are wonderful diagnostic tools, especially if you're trying to troubleshoot delta 8 versus delta 9. So that vinylogous proton there's a shift of about 1 ppm from about 4.2 to about 5.2, and in the carbon, that carbon shifts from about 119 to about 122. Those are really, really good diagnostic shifts. But you can't really get down into the weeds of what I think what Richard was referring to. Using GC mass spec is absolutely the right solution for this problem, because the mass spectrometer is going to be a whole lot more sensitive and he can get resolution. So I think what we need to do is solve this problem using the GC mass spec, but then use that to correlate back to HPLC purity, because that's what the bulk of the cannabis labs, at least that I work with, are using for doing cannabinoid determination. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, let me ask a question to you guys more deep into the industry there. I mean, how many producers are either either have in-house, I think the number is very low there, or collaborate with labs that are working with GCMS at this kind of level?
So the lab that I know of, they standardly use HPLC, DAD, or MWD for their potency. But when they were developing the methods, they were kind of debating whether to use a GCMS, and they did have the method on GC, but they just found that the quantification of the more standard cannabinoids was much better with an MWD and more reliable with the DAD, and they also didn't have to use internal standards. So I think, if they were to do an investigation of D8 specifically, then the GCMS is going to come in handy. But just for like what the goal of that lab in particular is, it's not really worth doing that on a regular basis unless someone orders that specifically, like that specific test. But I even had to kind of ask, like, I didn't get the chromatogram with the data. I asked for that, and then I got like a little bit more of an explanation of what maybe some of the unidentified peaks could be. So there was about like 4 or 5 little peaks that were below, just like kind of like one of them was D9. But then another one was hypothesized to be D10, but I'm not really sure if they have a standard for that, or if that was like maybe a GC investigation. But yeah, I just kind of need to get a little bit more information. And they also warned me about the iso THC isomers, and that could be inflating the D8 value. So it seems like, the labs kind of typically they aim for a sample turnover, but if you ask them questions, they're going to give you some more information, which is really helpful.
For what it's worth, we provide chromatograms on all of our C of A's so that the client can see the data from which we're working. And with regard to the GCMS question, I'm not aware of any other laboratory doing D8 work by GCMS. There may be labs out there, but we're not aware of them. And based upon what I've seen, and we've looked at a variety of different HPLC conditions and different reverse phase columns, not just C18, but some phenyl-based columns, and the iso compounds cannot be resolved from delta 8 and delta 9. So any laboratory that's reporting delta 8 synthetic materials based on reverse phase HPLC analysis may very well be producing erroneous results, both for delta 8 and delta 9.
So similarly for the lab folks on the call, this is more of a fun question. So what's the most challenging matrix containing delta 8 that you've tested so far, and how did you approach addressing the analytical challenges with that particular matrix? Oh, Dr. Sams, you are on mute.
I'll take a shot at it. I asked our analysts earlier today what the answer to this question might be. And there are two. One is any baked good due to the high presence of, or to the high concentration of lipids, they're just difficult to extract. But the other problem that they referred to was the fact that Delta 8 is being sprayed on plant material. When we're doing Delta 8s from synthetic mixtures, we don't have to worry about decarboxylation of the carboxylic acids, but those are still present in the plant material. And so quantification is really difficult when Delta 8 has been sprayed on plant material. Our preference is to use GCMS, but we know we're decarboxylating the acid precursors.
Yvonne, did you want to jump in on that too?
Yeah, I guess I would say that the testing with an MWD is pretty limited. So I think that they do have quite a bit of more investigating to do with their statement that there's other cannabinoids in the chromatogram. So yeah, I think that not only is the D8 that I tested below what it was reported on the label, so specifically it was reported to be 10 milligrams and it was tested to be 2.3 milligrams out of 10. And then that's just only looking at the peak that was supposedly only just like the supposed D8 peak, which could be more isomers underneath. So the actual value, which they did inform me of, could be even lower than 2.3 milligrams. So there's issues. It seems like there's issues with production and testing. So actually these samples, I've never tried them myself before, but I have tried their CBD products, and their CBD was tested within the regulations of Michigan, the state of Michigan. So it does kind of seem like even if a company is able to produce CBD products that meet the standards, it really doesn't necessarily mean that their D8 products are going to be up to standard, just because it's so much more difficult to do a chemical reaction or to be able to source material that's properly tested. So it's quite challenging. And also I haven't actually been working in PSI labs for the past year. I worked there before, so there's kind of a lot of like confidential information that they have about their testing, and sometimes just asking lots of questions. They have like quite a lot of sample turnaround. So in the state of Michigan, actually, they're going to they're going to start regulating the unregulated products and banning those in the fall, but then they're still actually allowing the regulated producers and dispensaries to be selling D8 products. So it's a little bit different from other states such as Nevada or Colorado, because they're still allowing the market for it. It's just it just has to pass the testing, but the testing doesn't say that there can't be those other isomers. So it's still kind of like there's still a little bit of gray area for the actual consumer seeing, what the data actually looks like. So it's, yeah, because the testing is assuming that it's all D8. So.
Is it possible we may have just lost Kyle? It looks like Yvonne is the host. You're talking about. Let me hazard taking this into an industry twist, because Yvonne, as you were talking about, how the regulation is going, one of the questions on many people's mouths is, should this be regulated in the sort of state marijuana industry or the hemp industry? And I guess I have a legal question to throw towards Chelsie for a second. I mean, when I think, because I've been in the regulated cannabis side a lot, and we're plagued by the 280E tax codes, and I look at all the hemp CBD shops and vape shops and overboard, above ground CBD companies that are now starting to say, well, the profit margins in D8, I'm going to go there. Are they creating a nightmare for their accountants here? Because it seems like suddenly, if the law gets clarified that, hey, DA is illegal and it always has been, are you going to have all these companies that suddenly are targeted by the 280E tax situation?
That would certainly be a regulatory nightmare because, as we've seen from the IRS, they're not going to do a company's work and bifurcate what's truly a cannabis enterprise versus a hemp enterprise. So I really pity the hemp companies if that happens. I don't anticipate that it will. The IRS has given no indication that they intend to apply 280E despite the DEA's prevalent stance on Delta 8. But it certainly, I will say, causes a lot of animosity would be the best word for it from the regulatory cannabis industry, who, as you noted, on general pays 70 to 78% back in taxes to the federal government. For those of you on the call who may not be aware, IRS 280E is a tax regulation that states if an enterprise is engaged in the sale or distribution of a Schedule I substance, they don't get any tax deductions outside of cost of goods sold. So whereas you all can deduct your employee lab salaries, your lights, your internet bill, not possible for them, only cost of goods sold. So that's an abundantly harsh regulation on the industry. And so the cannabis industry, in my opinion, is rightfully upset that you have a largely unregulated industry on the hemp side that is taking advantage of what it views as a legal loophole where they have such stringent regulations to abide by. I will note I work with several legislative advisement committees, and I anticipate that the federal government is going to fix this issue. As I stated, there's no argument that the congressional drafters of the 2018 Farm Bill did not intend for psychoactive substances to be sold freely on the market absent any limitations. And I do not anticipate the hemp industry is by and large going to be pleased with the proposed fix.
Yeah, that's there's a lot of people that are eagerly awaiting these rulings. So
Chelsie, could I ask a question, Kyle? Can I ask
Yeah.
Chelsie a question? So Chelsie, it's interesting that they didn't contemplate what us chemists already know, because we look in the literature and we know that you can convert CBD to THC. But did they contemplate that on an acre of hemp grown at 0.3%, that's 3 pounds of THC at 1,000 pounds an acre? So what happens to that 3 pounds of THC that's 0.3% or lower? Did they ever contemplate that?
Generally, no. There is a dearth in, and I will say, qualified advisement sometimes to our congressional offices when they're coming up with these regulations. And that's why so often our legislation is reactive instead of proactive, which is the problem we're seeing now, where you see individual states. And what I'm trying to convince the senators we're working with not to do is to go specifically after Delta 8. Because as you mentioned, you all know there's many more coming down the pipeline. So these reactive decisions are what are frankly causing these issues on legality in the first place. But if anyone on the call is interested in providing advice to these agencies, I also do feel for them, because when they put out calls for public comments, what we see is very few labs who are substantively participating and providing them guidance. So for example, the USDA put out a request for information on analytical testing measures for raw hemp materials. And they didn't receive a lot of substantive feedback from labs on what they believed a good quality set of parameters would be for them. So always federal regulatory agency or state regulatory agency is asking for input from the scientists. I highly encourage each and every one of you to be involved in that process.
completely agree. We can't make sound policy without good scientific basis for it, right? So I completely agree with that. We are coming towards the top of the hour here. We've got about 4 minutes. So I was thinking if there are any questions from the audience for our panelists, go ahead and ask them in the chat, and we'll see if we can squeeze in a few more. So I'll give you guys a couple minutes to contemplate those and get those in. All right, no questions from the audience. Anyone want to chime in? Feel free, or if any of our panelists have any other questions of their fellow panelists, please feel free to do so.
I've asked some of the major sellers of cannabinoid standards if they plan to make ISO THC derivatives, and they have indicated that they're 6 months to a year away from having those materials available. So we're having the ISO materials synthesized by one of our laboratory partners. And the goal is to produce a certified reference material for both Delta 8 ISO and Delta 4-8 ISO THC.
Yeah, I think that's definitely going to be really important as we try and find accurate numbers, because right now the numbers seem to be all over the board with a lot of different labs, especially with the different methods and not using the right tool for the right job.
Kyle,
yeah,
Kyle, can I ask Richard? So Richard, is there any safety or efficacy information on those isomers that is out there? Do you know?
I've looked and I have not found any. So it's a big unknown.
I'll reiterate, it's a big unknown. I was going to say something for those folks on the call that may be less chemistry immersed, that again, these ISO words get brought up. This is basically, one of you chemists can correct me if I say this wrong, but when the CBD gets into this reactive state in the acid, its easiest bonding partner is to close the ring, but it can take a contorted sort of twist and bond back on another part of the molecule. You get these iso THCs that are isomers, but they are completely unnatural. Are they dangerous to you? Are they possibly therapeutic? We totally don't know. I mean, could they screw your liver? Maybe. We really don't know. And that's the concern of people like us when we talk about this. And someone asked a question in the chat if there are any variations in cannabinoid receptors that might be impacted differently by different isomers of THC. Maybe, again, even when you talk about just straight Delta 8, we should remember that in the last 15 years has taught us that THC and other cannabinoids have many different targets aside from the original ones we called the cannabinoid receptors. It's part of the beauty of the ensemble entourage effect. But how does Delta 8 and certainly the isomers, Delta 10, almost virtually untouched research-wise, how do they affect these various TRP channels and PPAR targets? We really totally don't know. So I'm not running around saying the sky is falling and save your children, but this has to be taken seriously and regulated as a serious industry, regardless of how the specifics look, what the specifics end up looking like.
and I do have one more question for the group that I think is actually a really good one, and this is also probably more of Chelsea's wheelhouse. So regarding regulation of products sold, is there any liability being held against these companies' products for the products ending up in these regulated markets?
Sure. So I'll answer that in two parts here. We've not yet seen a private actor sue another company for violations of labeling regulations, but the Delta 8 industry would be remiss. Watch what happened with the CBD lawsuits. By and large, the federal court stayed those, but we recently saw in the past 3 months a California court allow one to move forward. As everybody on the call knows, these cannabinoids are volatile substances that are subject to degradation. And what's happened is we've seen plaintiff lawyers who will go into a shop, purchase a product that makes a labeling claim as to quantity. They'll test it. It comes back below the label claim that's made, and then they'll sue either on violations of Food and Drug Cosmetics Acts, false and deceptive labeling, or various state claims. And it's the state claims that people should really be concerned with. As far as Delta 8 enforcement, we have seen, as I mentioned at the top of the hour with the Champs trade show, people who, regulators that came onto the floor and just simply gave an admonishment to follow the regulations. We haven't seen arrests yet, but keep in mind, some of these regulatory bans are brand spanking new. This was a domino effect that started falling roughly 60 to 90 days ago. And those of us in the industry have been trying to warn the hemp industry this was coming, but now the dominoes are starting to fall. So we haven't seen specific criminal enforcement activity. On the regulatory side, most state regimes allow for a certain allotment of violations, negligent violations, before a license would be pulled or any drastic measure such as that.
Gotcha, makes sense. Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their time and their insights today. That was truly a very insightful discussion, and I learned a lot today, and I hope the audience you did as well. The recording will be up in a few weeks, so keep an eye out for that. And I wish everyone a great rest of their day. Thanks for attending.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Kyle. Bye, everybody.
Bye all.